Yeah, hello everyone. May I please have your attention, if you can? Hello there at the back. Hello there. You can hear me from there? Fantastic. Welcome. Thank you for coming. My name is Moses Oketch, and I chair the Center for Education and International Development Seminar Series. We call it CEID Seminar Series in short. I work together with William to make sure that these series are there. The series is an opportunity for us to hear about the work done by colleagues here, as well as other academics and practitioners across the world, whom we invite, whom we collaborate with, to try to improve humanity through research and evidence. So that's part of what we do. Today's seminar is actually our first in terms of this academic year, although we had a presentation about 2 weeks ago that was focused on Thailand, I think so. But this is our that was an ad hoc one. This one is our official first CEID seminar series. I would encourage you to be on the look for the next ones. We send them via Eventbrite. We've got a network there. If you want your email to be included, please talk to William so that you can get an update when the next talk is going to take place. I think we've got another one coming up next week or the week after. Today, we are very delighted to have a focus on gender and teacher education in Nigeria. I couldn't think of any other topic really important today than this topic. If you can get teachers to be effective, and if you can bring issues of gender and inclusivity and the complex context of Nigeria, if we can gather better evidence and know how to solve that, I think that will really improve education there. And we are very lucky to have Professor Elaine Unterhalter and Dr. Amy North and Yvette Hutchinson from British Council, who are going to present to us on this topic. I think it will be better to let them introduce themselves, say a little bit about their work, rather than me saying who they are. But two of them are my colleagues here, and we've got a wonderful colleague from British Council. With that, I don't want to eat into the time of the presentation. I welcome them, and I say this seminar for today is open, and we look forward to hearing and being enlightened on the topic.
First of all, is that job of getting to the microphone. Okay, and then okay, my name's Yvette Hutchinson, as Moses has said. Can you hear me? Yes. Right, I work for the British Council, and for some reason you can see my desktop rather than my presentation, but hopefully that will change in a moment. What I do in the British Council is I work in the schools team. And what we do in the schools team is work around three priorities really: thought leadership, professional development, and we also do a lot of work on capacity building. So those are the things we do, and I'm saying that while this gentleman kindly sees if he can fix the computer. If he can't, that's fine. Let me tell you about what the British Council does. The British Council is about 85 years old, and we work in arts, English, and society, education and society. And what we do is, and I quote, friendly knowledge and understanding. And I think the idea was that in a very divided 1930s world, the British Council was going to work to encourage countries to talk to each other and to work together and to do lots of collaboration. And in my job, that's what I do, a lot of work on encouraging collaboration. The reason why I'm here today is because this research was partly funded by the British Council. And I thought I'd tell you a little bit about what we do in Nigeria. And what I did rapidly this afternoon was talk to some Nigerian colleagues, and they gave me their vision. And here it is. And the idea of the British Council working in Nigeria is that we're bringing people together, friendly knowledge and understanding. And there are a variety of ways in which we do that. And one of the things that we try to do is to encourage systems reform by working with. And I say working with deliberately because it's an exchange of equals and equal minds rather than anything else. Just to tell you a little bit about some of our programs, as I said, continuing professional development for school leaders, teachers and teacher trainers is one of the things we do. We also are doing a project called Fast Forward, which is training teachers on new teaching methodologies. There's other work that we're doing around active citizens, and that's particularly in this sort of HE spectrum. And then finally, I don't know if anybody knows about our Premier Skills project, but we work with the English Premier League Football Association. And the idea is that we do programs that would empower particularly young girls to do sport, and then through that coaching of them and developing their own coaching skills, what we also then do is help them to become sort of community advocates in that space. So that's a little bit about what we do. Today, obviously, we're going to be talking about the teacher education research, and my colleagues will talk to you more about that. And I've put this up because we don't have any hard copies, but I thought I'd like you to see what it would look like if you ever had it in your hand. So there it is. Prior to this research, the British Council in 2012 did a piece of research on gender in Nigeria, and there were 10 key findings which came up, and I'm just putting them up there because I think you'll find when we have this discussion this afternoon that many of the things that came up in that 2012 research are key themes that are still relevant. So obviously inequality of opportunity, the need for implementation once policies have been established, and the growth of unemployment, and how, and we know, income inequality affects women more. One of the things that we found out during that piece of research was the regional difference in the kind of gender disparities, and how there are obstacles for women in some of the many ways in which they could actually be agents for their own liberation, if you will. Girls' education and the lack or the paucity of it in certain circumstances came up. Issues of maternal mortality, and the big thing about who makes decisions, which I think is not, as with many of these things, not discrete to Nigeria, but affects all women across the world. And then finally, of course, the issue of violence against women and girls. So those were the things that the 2012 research highlighted. And I think at this stage, I'd like to hand over to Elaine and Amy so that they can then give their presentations about this new piece of research and tell us a little bit about what we've learned from it. And at the end of that, I'll come back and say a little bit about what we're doing with that, and then we can respond to your questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Yvette. I'm afraid I might need some help just getting our presentation. Okay, so I'll talk a bit about the research project, and the collaborations involved, some of our assumptions, some of what happened through the research process, and some of where we're going with the ideas. The work was funded by the MacArthur Foundation through the British Council, and the MacArthur Foundation had set up a program for a number of studies looking at adolescence and education in Nigeria. And we set out initially planning the study in 2013 and then conducting it from 2014 to 2016. We were interested in whether there was a connection between what teachers learned in initial teacher education preset and continuous professional development around gender and gender equality issues, whether they were able to put that into practice in the schools in which they went to work, and whether that had any relationship with girls' learning outcomes. So we were developing this assumption that there was a kind of a continuous pipeline between what teachers learned in teacher education, and that if there were minimum standards about gender equality in schools, as they had been introduced in 2012 in Nigeria, and I'll talk a little bit about that context, they would be implemented. So we're working with this assumption that teacher education works a bit like a machine. You put stuff into the heads of beginning teachers, and they will come out with all the right kinds of attitudes and implement them in schools. And that's an assumption that's written into the policy text. It's written into the way a lot of EFA policy is thought about. And we also considered that there would be, that once you were training teachers, teachers would get work in school. So those were initial assumptions written into the design of the research, written into the funders' assumptions, and into the way we conducted the study based on other work we'd done. Everything about the study was a huge surprise. One of the this slide just summarizes some of the 5 surprises, and we'll talk through this in a lot more detail. One of the surprises was that there are multiple interruptions around gender equality, both what people think and why they think it, whether teacher education can engage with and present gender equality in ways that students can hear or engage with, and whether trained teachers can take that knowledge into schools. So we documented those multiple, that notion of the smooth pipeline is absolutely the wrong metaphor. The second issue we found was that and why this was so surprising to us, you know, you only learn afterwards how stupid you were at the beginning of the research project you set up. Why we thought student teachers would be any different from anybody else in a society which the British Council study, as Yvette had outlined, is highly marked by gender inequalities. And as this was, I think, the 3rd research project I'd done in Nigeria, I'd understood how complex and diverse the forms of gender inequality were in the society. So where the assumption came from that student teachers were this paradigm group who would be able to examine the ideas of gender inequality in the society and just change them in a brief 3-year study, I don't know, but we were quickly disabused of that. But we were also clear that there were very important class and gender and regional and social and political differences amongst teachers. The third thing that was a huge shock to us, and I think to some extent initially to members of our research team, and then afterwards they just shrugged it off and said, but this is, we didn't really expect to find anything different, was that just a tiny proportion of trained teachers found work in schools. In a society in which the pupil-teacher ratios are 100 to 1, and where in Lagos only 4% of students attend state schools because there's been such a shortage. So teachers are being trained, but they're not finding work, which was a real shock to us. Other findings are more recognizable, that there's hardly any continuous professional development to teachers, very, very stretched resources on that. That teachers, but the depth of the attitudes around gender inequality, I think, was surprising to us, and we'll show you some more detail of that. And then that girls and boys equally had very minimal positive ideas about gender equality and girls' rights was also surprising to us. So these are our 6 key findings, and we're now just going to show you some of the data that underpins it. But I'll first just explain a little bit about the research process. It was a very collaborative research project that involved researchers from UCL, IOE, and from a number of Nigerian institutions. And a lot of data was collected and analyzed using an important iterative process. And a key to the depth of analysis I think we were able to develop was the work of this external advisory committee that the British Council convened and that met annually to review the work and guide some of the design of the research instruments and interpret the findings. The study took place in 5 Nigerian states. The states were given to us by the MacArthur Foundation because that was where they funded. So it was 2 states in the south, Lagos and Rivers. I haven't got a clicker, but Rivers is right down at the bottom and it's blue. Sorry, Amy, could you click them? Lagos and Rivers. Lagos is a huge commercial center. Rivers is associated with the oil industry, but also an area of a lot of insecurity. And then 3 states in the north, Jigawa, Kano, and right up at the top, Sokoto, so more in the northwest. And those 3 northern states had their own very distinctive political economy, as we will talk through in a minute. Just some background on the context of Nigeria for those of you to whom who it's not very familiar. There are large pupil-teacher ratios in most states in Nigeria and a paucity of skilled teachers. But the process of recruiting teachers is very, very flawed. So education is dealt with at state level, and state structures to recruit and pay teachers are very uneven, and the resources to do this don't flow very well. So that the resource provision in schools, often there are very few trained teachers, very large numbers of untrained teachers are recruited or paid for by parent-teacher associations. And this is particularly a pattern of rural areas. Teachers don't have their salaries paid. And in Lagos, you've had this huge proliferation of private schools because of the lack of provision by the state sector. At all levels of formal schooling in Nigeria, there are marked gender inequalities, but poverty exacerbates this, so that in the bottom 2 quintiles, there's many less girls in school, much less provision of education, and much greater dropout. And this persists into junior secondary school. And there's a lot of report of and difficulties of dealing with gender-based violence. There have been various state attempts to address expansion of education and put in place strategies for gender equality. And the significant ones are on the slide. The 2004 Universal Basic Education Act, which asserts that it's a right of every child in Nigeria to have an education. The 2007 Gender in Basic Education Policy, which was very much in line with international declarations. And then in 2012, this introduction of minimum standards for gender equality in teacher education, and very, very detailed specification of how teacher training and what teachers should do to ensure gender equality, which is why we designed the study to investigate how this was being implemented. The research design was quite complicated. At the heart of it were these 4,494 student teachers in the 5 different states, in teacher education institutions and higher education and universities on teacher education courses. It was in their last year of their teacher education course that we interviewed them. And we asked them both about the training they'd received about gender equality and also about a range of attitudes they had about gender equality and women's rights. And we'll talk through some of that, what the content of those surveys were. We also did interviews with the staff who were delivering the teacher education courses. And so that was in 2014, June 2014. We did a follow-up survey in January, and we reached a good percentage of the initial cohort and wanted to find out whether they had found work. This is 6 to 8 months after their course had finished. And this was the first inkling we got that teachers were being trained but not deployed. We then followed a cohort of teachers into work in junior secondary schools and wanted to see whether they were able to, and in what ways they were able to put anything about inclusion or gender equality into practice. And we also interviewed the teachers in the schools about their experiences and views around gender, and also what level of CPD they had. And then, because the findings were so difficult about how difficult people had found getting jobs and how persistent gender inequalities were, we did some follow-up focus groups to examine our findings. So it was an iterative and evolving research design. Just some background information on the characteristics of who we interviewed. We were aiming for 1,000 students in each state. We weren't able to achieve that in Kano because there was a bomb attack at the time of our data collection and some insecurity for the research team, which meant that the cohort from Kano was smaller than that from the other states. And because it's going to be significant in some of the findings, I just want you to note that the cohort from Jigawa was entirely College of Education, not university students. The distribution by gender is largely similar to that of the distribution of teachers in Nigeria, so that in the 2 southern states, Lagos and Rivers, in the sample there were more women than men, and in the 3 northern states, there are larger numbers of men than women, and that, I haven't got the figures, but that's generally the profile in the of the teaching force in those 5 states. We also asked students about where they had their own education, and we were interested on whether student teachers had migrated for their education or what their socioeconomic background was. And what this table, so we were looking at whether they came from a community with no primary school, a very rural setting, we thought, because how you interpret rural and urban differs. So we had these classifications of an area quite cut off with no primary school, with 1 primary school, a town with a primary or secondary school, and then moving to larger towns and then large state capitals. You can see that the majority of those we interviewed, the majority in the cohort, came from large and very large towns, except in Jigawa. And that's going to be significant in some of our other findings in a minute. So they're primarily from an urban background. We also asked the students about the socioeconomic status of their parents, and we were trying to understand what background they came from. You can see that the students in Lagos, which is a large commercial sector, had a much higher mean family socioeconomic score than any of the others, and that Jigawa, where the students are primarily in College of Education and much more from a rural background, had the lowest mean family socioeconomic score. Am I handing over to you now or the next slide, Amy? I'll do just one more slide. What the students said is that 2/3 said they wanted to work as teachers. But in the students from the higher socioeconomic class and from the more southern states, there was less than half said they wanted to work as teachers. But in Jigawa, the group where the group is from a lower socioeconomic class and a more rural background, this is where the majority said they wanted to work as teachers. And that's going to be, I'll hand over to Amy now because then you'll see something very sad happened to them. This is the data that just shows those views. This on.
So you can see here that when we asked students about why they had chosen to study to become teachers, as Elaine was saying, in the northern states, we saw the vast majority were saying they were on teacher training courses because they wanted to become teachers. So there was a very strong sense of motivation to training and then following that into teaching practice. But in the southern states, and most notably in Lagos, actually in Lagos, fewer than 50% said they were on a teacher training course because they wanted to become teachers. More often it was because they hadn't necessarily got admission onto the course of their choice, either at the institution they were studying in or at another institution, or some of them just said they were enrolled on the course but actually they weren't really that interested in it. So there was quite a notable difference between the mostly urban students in Lagos and what we found in the northern states. In Jigawa, 82% had this strong commitment to wanting, or strong motivation to wanting to continue on into becoming teachers once they'd finished their training. Let's see, does this work? When we went back 6 months in January, which was 6 months after students would have graduated and qualified as teachers, to ask them what they were actually doing, as Elaine has already alluded to, the findings were really quite shocking and quite surprising. And you can see here in the January column here, the proportion that were working as teachers across all the states was extremely low. In Lagos, it was slightly higher than in the other states, even though that was the state where actually fewest student teachers had said they wanted to become teachers. But in the northern states, it was considerably less than 20% in any of the states. And in Kano, it was only, I think it was less than 5%. So very, very low numbers had actually found their way into getting teaching jobs. We went back again to follow up with them in October, so that was a full year after they'd qualified, to see whether those patterns had changed. And we found that in some states, slightly more students had found their way into teaching. So these are not students anymore, newly qualified teachers. But in Jigawa, actually the proportion had dropped. And it wasn't actually that many of the students had gone on into other paid work. The vast majority said that they were unemployed, they were currently looking for jobs, but they weren't managing to find them. So this for us was a really kind of shocking and surprising finding, that we know in these states there are very high pupil-teacher ratios, there's massive shortages of teachers, and yet the teachers that were being trained and coming through the system weren't actually getting jobs in schools. So we convened a series of focus groups in each state to try and explore some of the reasons why this might be. In each state we convened 2 focus groups, one with a group of our original survey cohort who had managed to find jobs as teachers, and one with a group of our original cohort who were unemployed and hadn't found jobs as teachers. And across all states, they raise kind of many common themes around some of the problems of finding work in teaching jobs. So corruption was a big theme, a big problem that was emphasised by many of them. They talked about issues around political party affiliations and who jobs were being given to according to what their party affiliation was. Also issues around ethnicity and jobs being given, or applicants for jobs being prioritised according to ethnicity. And also issues around gender, which were sometimes then linked to ethnicity as well. Also issues around whether or not a teacher had trained in or out of the state. So lots of reasons why the labour market didn't seem to be working as it should be, and there were problems around who was being allocated jobs and why. In specific states, they talked about issues around status in the community, issues around security, and also issues around family relationships, and particularly in the northern states, some of the constraints that were put on newly qualified female teachers being able to take up jobs in different locations, for example, so issues around their mobility. So there was a kind of complex range of different interacting factors that seem to be affecting the ability of the education system to actually absorb and make use of the teachers that were being trained and were qualified and ready and wanting to teach. So that was the first kind of really big finding from the study, and one that we hadn't expected. So it was the second follow-up survey that we did in a year after the trainee teachers had finished training wasn't initially in our research design, because we were expecting in January to find that many of the teachers that in our original cohort had found jobs in schools. We would then be able to follow them into the schools and carry on with our data collection in schools. When we found out that none of them were actually teaching, we had to change our research design to do a second follow-up survey to try and understand a little bit more about what was going on. Oops. So that's the first finding in relation to whether or not teachers who are being trained are actually getting into schools. But the initial kind of premise of the research was also about, as Elaine said, understanding whether commitments to supporting gender equality in education and the ways in which those were then being put into the teacher training curriculum were actually affecting the way in which new teachers and trainee teachers were engaging with ideas around gender. And so in the initial survey we did with the cohort of student teachers, we had a range of questions that tried to help us understand how they were engaging with ideas around gender in their training and then more generally. So we first of all had a series of questions asking students what they thought they had learnt on their teacher training course and whether or not they felt they had been taught about a range of issues to do with gender and inclusion. I'll show you those in a moment. We also asked key informants at the institutions that they were studying in, so some of the teacher trainers, about what they thought they were teaching students about the same issues. And then we had a series of questions that were aimed to try and understand the views and attitudes that the trainee teachers had towards different aspects of gender and inclusion. So these are some of the different subject or top subject areas that we asked the trainee teachers whether they thought they had been given any teaching on during their teacher training course, in order to try and understand the extent to which inclusion was included. Issues around gender inclusion were really being included in their learning. And we used these in order to construct an inclusion score to measure the extent to which issues around gender and inclusion were being taught and engaged with by the students. The inclusion score was weighted, so you can see some of these issues around girls' schooling, gender-based violence, poverty, and so on were weighted, doubly weighted in the inclusion score. What we found when we calculated that score was there was a very significant difference in what male trainee students were telling us and the female students. So Female students were much more likely to say that they felt they had been taught about these issues than the male students. In all cases, we didn't find that they were telling us they'd learnt a huge amount about any of these issues. But this, to us, seemed to raise particular issues about what was being learnt in the institutions where trainee teachers were predominantly male in the northern states, which was where we had most motivation among students to become teachers, but also suggests there was a difference in the ways in which male and female students were engaging with these issues in their learning. When we compared what staff in the institutions said about what they thought they were teaching on these issues and what students said they thought they were learning, the pattern was a little bit varied between the different states, as you can see here. So the red line is staff, what staff are saying, the blue line is what students are saying. But generally, the staff seemed to think they were teaching more about the issues than the students felt that they were learning. So there was a disconnect between what in theory was being taught and what students were actually taking away and engaging with. Okay. So we then asked a series of questions which we asked students to respond to a series of statements about different aspects of gender equality, inclusion, and girls' and women's rights. And on the basis of that, we calculated what we're calling a Gender in Education Attitude Index. We then broke that down into 3 sub-indices. One which relates to views on gender equality in education, public life, and the home. One which related more to ideas around challenging conventional masculinities. And then one that was specifically relating to aspects of teacher professional conduct and inclusive practice. Here, what we're showing is the percentage of student teachers in each state who could be seen to meet a minimum threshold in terms of their positive answers in relation to these different statements that indicates what we would describe as a positive attitude towards gender equality. And what you can see here is pretty low numbers of students overall reaching that threshold of having a positive attitude on gender equality, and particularly low amongst the male students and in the 3 northern states. The patterns are different once you break it down into the sub-indices. So we saw a slightly surprising finding that actually when we talked about kind of challenging conventional forms of masculinity, the pattern was reversed in the relationship between the southern and the northern states. And what was a kind of really important finding was the very, very low scores in relation to teacher professional conduct and inclusive practice. So this again suggests a really kind of significant disconnect between the policy on paper, the curriculum on paper, and then the views and attitudes and ideas of the teachers, the student teachers. And these are some examples of some of the statements that we asked the student teachers to respond to. And in the top you can see the views of the female teachers, the scores of the female teachers. In the bottom it's the male teachers. So women have the right to hold leadership positions in the community. A female president can be as effective as a male president. Girls have the same right to go to school as boys, whether girls should be allowed to play sports, whether boys should be allowed to play sports. What we found was the patterns were quite different for many of the different statements, but male teacher trainees, for example, were much more likely to blame female students for sexual harassment or pregnancy. 2/3 of male students thought that girls who had an early pregnancy should be allowed to return to school, but that was much lower than the women, was 81%. And the responses really suggested that there's a really big challenge in terms of developing thinking and ideas and engagement with ideas around gender equality, particularly in the institutions in the northern states with the larger proportion of male students. In the universities, students seem to have slightly more equitable views, but actually those were also where students were less likely to actually go and take up jobs in teaching. So again, some really kind of big, challenging disconnections. So after we had finished our surveys with the cohorts of initial trainee teachers, in each state we followed 6 newly qualified teachers into junior secondary schools, and we conducted interviews with those teachers but also with their colleagues in school, the head teachers and girls and boy learners. And we asked them the same sets of questions around their views on gender equality. What we found was that actually more experienced teachers, and particularly the head teachers, tended to have slightly more gender equitable views than the new teachers that were recently qualified and coming through the teacher training system, which supposedly had more of an emphasis on gender in the curriculum. So again, there was something wasn't quite working there. We found that there wasn't a significant relationship or statistically significant relationship between the views of teachers and how much continuing professional development training they had, but actually very few teachers in the schools had significant amounts of CPD. So that relationship, it was difficult to say much about that relationship because they had so little opportunities, so few opportunities to engage with CPD. And then a very kind of striking finding was that when we asked teachers about what they were trying to do to develop more inclusive practices in the classroom, what we found was that the teachers who said most about how they were trying to be inclusive in their teaching practice were also the ones that seemed to be most unhappy with their working conditions, which seemed to suggest that actually trying to put ideas about inclusion in a context where you're very unsupported to do that into practice is extremely stressful and extremely difficult. So we also spoke to girl and boy learners. We asked them about their views and attitudes to gender equality, asking exactly the same questions that we had asked to the trainee teachers and the teachers. And then we tried to look at how those views might be correlated with their experiences of inclusion in school and also their class position. So just to give you a sense of that data. Here we're showing the proportion of children who could be seen to have positive gender attitudes. And again, the blue shows the boys, the red shows the girls. You can see that in some states, the proportion, particularly of boys, was very, very low. Although actually the attitudes of girls in some of the states was quite a lot more positive than often than their teachers. When we correlated this to what the girl and boy learners said they were, how included they felt in the school and in the classroom. So we asked a series of questions that tried to understand how they were experiencing or not inclusive education. What we found was that girls and boys who said they felt more included and safer in school were also more likely to have positive attitudes towards gender equality. And that was a statistically significant relationship. So it suggests that inclusive teaching practice also is supportive of developing more inclusive, more gender equitable attitudes. There was also, particularly among boys, a correlation towards how well they were doing at school and how likely they were to have more gender equitable attitudes. That could be seen with both girl and boy learners, but most significantly with boy learners. Elaine, should I hand back over to you to talk to some of our conclusions?
Yeah, well, I think we'll talk about some of our academic conclusions, and then Yvette maybe about some of the implications for the British Council. It was clear to us that work is needed to train teachers better and place them in schools and support them. and that girls and boys will be supported in learning about inclusion if their teachers are supported. None of that is rocket science, but it's very, very difficult to effect. The promotion of engagement with ideas about gender and girls' rights in teacher education through initial training into CPD, this seems absolutely crucial and not to have been done with any depth or with any depth in any of the 5 states in which we did the study. The link between teachers' pre-service training and what they were able to do the lack of teachers getting jobs was most pronounced in the 3 northern states, but that's because the teachers in the 2 southern states had got jobs, often in the most ramshackle private schools, that it was very, very difficult for our research team to even describe its schools, but this was the way in which teachers were getting jobs, but the nature of the schools was very, very problematic. And then our 3rd recommendation was about supporting the continued professional development of teachers as an absolute imperative for work at the education system level in Nigeria. Is it this one? No, this one. So we completed the study 2 years ago, and what we felt is a huge gap in the literature on teacher education. The literature on teacher education is very, very small in relation to Nigeria, and largely just a handful of studies on all the countries in Africa. So we think what the study draws attention to is the need for a large research program on teacher education, drawing in all the countries of Africa and really taking seriously what the nature of that education is, who the people are who are going through that education, and what their experiences of work are. The other thing that emerged from the study was the nature of the teacher labor market. Again, very, very little studied. It's assumed because teachers are deployed by governments that the labor market is a form of state distribution. What our study showed is how very local and irrationally contoured in many ways the teacher labor market is in the different settings in which we did the work. Gender equality and inclusion are often just wrapped up in these phrases like gender responsive pedagogy, gender responsive curriculum, but the work to translate that into detailed experiences of higher education, of professional practice, and of different groups talking to each other through different kinds of experiences, all of that is a whole terrain of work still to be done academically. And then the issue about which girls and boys can develop insights around gender equality and why, and what kinds of work needs to be done with boys to develop positive attitudes around women's participation in public life, women's participation in social and cultural life, and to address the problems of gender-based violence and sexual harassment, all of which nobody seems to have a language to talk about. All of that emerged from the study. I'm just going to make 3 more comments on follow-up thoughts from since the time we finished the study and where Amy and I have been taking this work. What it's raised for us is that the discussion of education systems, which is a phrase that's widely used in the policy community, it's central to the work of GPE, it's central to DFID's latest education strategy, that systems are not very well defined. So the notion of the education system is either some kind of path-dependent relationship. So you click a switch in the system and the information learn about gender equality or learn about classroom management flows down a path. That's the most common way in which systems are described or assumed. A second way is that systems can be thought of as ecologies, that they're linked to social and economic environments, but nobody really knows what the key relationships are. And the third way that we've been kicking around might be fruitful of thinking about them is to draw on the work of Ben Fine, who worked in the 1980s on thinking about consumption as a form of system of provision, that education is a system of provision, and that what we need to think about are the systems, the actions, the processes, and the discourses that shape the system of provision of education. And gender will be mapped through all of those. I did a follow-up study to this British Council study and another piece of work that I'm not going to talk to in any detail because I hope there'll be another CEID seminar on it, but going back to Lagos and looking at teachers in public and private schools around gender equality and their views on gender equality. And what we found was that the teachers in the public schools who had more teacher education had much more positive attitudes than the teachers in private and commercial schools, often who had hardly any formal teacher education. So that issue of what level of attitude about gender equality in public and private schools, I think, is a very fruitful area to explore. And then the last one is how it repositions the questions of girls' education, which is too often shown in the policy discourse as the answer to everything. It shows the kind of complex environments in which interventions on girls' education nestle, and that need themselves to be understood with a lot more analytic and political acumen than I think we've yet deployed. Thanks.
Thank you. Even though I've read the report a few times, it's still quite interesting to hear people talk about it and the different stresses. So the stresses that you gave are not necessarily the stresses that I read when I looked at the research. And one of the things that I said at the beginning was that one of the ways we work in the British Council is very much around sort of friendly knowledge and understanding. I would say another significant thing is that in order for us to develop programs that are going to be helpful to countries and for education systems, we need evidence base. We need a good, strong evidence base. So for us, this is useful for a variety of reasons, not just for the work in Nigeria, and perhaps depending on the kinds of questions that people ask, I might tell you a little bit about some gender work that we're doing. In fact, I spent quite a lot of the summer putting together a paper for our board around the British Council's developing its work around gender education, because naturally this is something that we need to take even more seriously. And I'm sure you're aware of the sort of donor community and the DFID strategic vision and all of those things that are making gender a priority, and anybody who is working in this field has some minimum requirements now around gender. Okay, what I thought I would finally do is just say a little bit about what we have done since this research was conducted. One of the first things I want to say is that something that I feel personally is that when we are talking about research about a country or communities, I always think people from that community and from those countries, it's always good to hear their voices. So one of the things I tried to do was to speak to my colleagues in Lagos, because I feel that I'm here very much a London-based individual representing the views of people in Nigeria. But one of the things that they said was, naturally, this piece of research helped them to really understand some of the factors that contribute to the exclusion of girls in education. And obviously, we know that there is an exclusion, but some of the nuances that came out in the research was very, very helpful to them. And one of the things that I'm very proud of was that as a result of that, and informed by this research, the team in Nigeria are beginning to work with other partners, and they've established what they've called the Girls' Education Advocacy and Research Network. And what they've produced is they've done some more detailed research in, I think there's 7 essays, and it's with young Nigerian researchers. So the idea has been, well, what do we need to learn about girls' education, and who do we need to learn from? And what they've been doing is working with local partners to get young people to do some research in their own particular areas about aspects of gender and education. And I can talk to you a little bit more about that depending on the questions you ask. This has given strength to the British Council to work with ministries of education. This is what we do generally, but it's given us strength to say, here is some evidence. You say, governments, that you want to have a more inclusive approach. Well, here is some evidence to assist you, and this is a way in which we, the British Council, can broker, because we do some delivery, but a lot of what we do is brokering, identifying, and again, bringing people together, collaborating, and bringing people together in order that system reform, and I use the term system carefully, can be developed in partnership with the right partners. We've always worked with curriculum bodies, and this has helped us again to work to support the curriculum development. But obviously what the research has shown is that it's not just about what the teachers are taught in teacher training. It also has implications for what they are able to teach in schools and what children learn. But equally, I think you said something about the stress levels of those who are really interested in doing this because they are not working in a hospitable context. And then finally, and again, we've always done this, is working with the local authorities and local teacher networks to develop guidelines. But again, those systems are quite ad hoc, and it's not as seamless as we would like it to be. I thought I would end with a quotation from the report in 2012, because this seems to me the kind of thing that people will be saying forever when it comes to research, because the impact of the study will not be achieved without the support of a high-level panel of change champions who encourage and exhort the state and sections of society to address the inequalities and barriers that face adolescent girls and women in Nigeria. Now, they said this was what the forward from our report said in 2012, and I suspect that's the kind of thing that you would feel in your report, and I suspect it's something that we're still going to be asking in the future. But it is about working with the right partners and considering the next steps together with the voice of the people who live there and are agents of change in their own way, working alongside them. I'm going to stop talking, and then hopefully you will ask some questions which will allow me to respond with some of the bits and pieces that I've got here. Oops, glasses went. Can I take this off? Marvellous.
We have plenty of time, about 30 minutes of discussion and question. Very insightful presentation, contextually challenging. So thank you to our presenters, and the floor is open for questions. Probably we take 3 at one go, and then we carry on in the rounds until about 7 o'clock. Yeah, please.
I'll try and shout if you can hear me. Thank you all for the hi, my name is Roy. I work for Plan International in the UK. I'm an education and emergencies program specialist. And we've got a few projects in Nigeria, so it's good man. Hey. Seen one of these before. So yeah, we've got a few education and emergencies projects in Nigeria. So it's those 5 localities I'm not familiar with. There's some aspects of education in Nigeria, some of the challenges really resonated with me when you were speaking earlier, because it's a lot of the challenges somewhat more amplified in the northeast idea than it is Australia. My question is, to what extent do you see the problem of inadequate budget allocated to the education sector in Nigeria as a contributing factor to a lot of the challenges where teachers not having jobs, teachers not facing the right way, teachers not developed properly, and also all aspects of the gender aspect. We're talking about displacement costs money. And it's just always baffled me that Nigeria, at least believe the figures, has the highest GDP in Sub-Saharan Africa, one of the least budget allocated to education in the whole continent, which is quite baffling. So I'd love to hear what connection you think that has with some of the challenges we're talking about. Thank you.
Any other question? Somebody who has comment? Okay. Yes, carry on.
No,
I was just passing it. The chance is going to
Oh,
help.
she's not asking a question. So maybe we take that and, maybe the answers will stimulate more questions. So, please.
It is a very fraught question. It's partly got to do with the politics of Nigeria and the way the budget is distributed. So because they're actually funding for education flows in 3 different ways. There's federal money that goes to the state, but is then held at the state level. And then a lot of local politics determines whether and how the money at the state level is distributed to schools, which schools it goes to. There is a small amount of money that's collected at the local government level and spent in relation to primary education. But there is a huge, there are massive backlog. So when we presented through this very useful British Council convening process that Yvette was describing, when we presented at our dissemination seminars and even at the advisory group the findings from the study, and we said, why are you seeing these figures in Jigawa? And the education secretary, or the person from Jigawa who was on our board, said, we have been waiting for 3 years to be able to deploy our the money we've been allocated. So money, it's not even that there isn't money, it's that it's not being deployed. And so this issue of how money flows and who it flows to and how is tied up with complex local politics. And one of the kind of elements of the tragedy, well, the tragedy is too big, the wrong word, but the process that you've seen in Lagos, which is this huge, vibrant commercial city, and this mushrooming of thousands of private schools. So everybody, more or less, who can open a private school will. It's like the kind of cry of the dispossessed for education. And yet people who work in the state sector are utterly committed. And this more recent study I did, both the teachers and the parents of people who use the public schools in Lagos, which are free and private schools are not free, have a huge commitment. But so the system isn't rationally working, and it's Moses or others who know about these economic processes might be able to comment on why the system is so out of kilter, so massively out of kilter.
I don't have an economics answer, but I could say to you that we have the picture of the puzzle. We know what a good system should look like and what it should produce. In some countries, we know that the pieces of the puzzle exist, but they have not been arranged properly, so you don't get that picture out. In other countries, we know the picture and all the puzzles are in a bag, but you don't know which ones are broken, which ones are completely missing, so you have to create a new one. So we don't know. You have to really, in that kind of situation, you really have to struggle, because you can, where all the pieces are available, they're just put wrongly, that system can be fixed. Where we completely can't even know whether all those puzzles exist, then really it's a system struggle. And I think, as you said, more research is needed. My question, just to add though, is comparing the North and the South. I was intrigued by the differences in attitude between the men and women in relation to inclusive or gender aspects of their training. I wonder whether this also varies by socioeconomic differences that Amy presented, and that the regional factor did not play. I mean, I think you had a very small sample for that. But if you considered a wealthy, reasonably wealthy male from the North and a reasonably wealthy male from the South, did their socioeconomic status diminish the differences, or was a regional factor very strong that even if they were very similar in their economic status, they would still hold these distinctive views just by regional difference?
No, you're quite correct. You want to answer on that one?
Yeah, I mean, what we did was we correlated the gender attitude scores with the socioeconomic scores, both of the family as a whole and then of the mothers and of the fathers. And where we found a really strong relationship was between the participants, the student teachers' attitude towards gender equality and their mother's socioeconomic status. So where we had households in which the mother was in a higher status professional position, the participants were much more likely to have positive gender equality scores. We were much more likely to find that in Lagos, where it was much more likely that the mother would be working and employed than in the northern states. That partly answers your question.
It does. That's clear. Any more questions? Yes. Now that has generated questions. Yes. Carry on.
Hi. Thank you all. That was really interesting, and it's really interesting to hear both the academic follow-ups and also the practical follow-ups. I have a question about the finding relating to the girls and boys' position in class and the extent to which that correlated with gender equitable attitudes. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about how you would interpret that, I guess both conceptually but also in terms of the implications for pedagogy, or the implications for what that might mean in terms of training teachers for understanding how to deliver more questions.
Yeah, I'll try, and then Amy, do you want to develop? Our interest in investigating this came from the earlier study we'd done for ActionAid in Tanzania and Nigeria, where and actually there's research in Kenya which had also shown this, that teachers make assumptions about children's aptitudes, and those are gender assumptions, and then basically you teach to the top of the class. And what that seemed to be showing is that children were performing children who felt more successful could also articulate more gender equitable views, although those children might also have come from the higher socioeconomic groups that, or with educated mothers, because that might be part of the Amy's response to Moses. I think all of that shows is that so much more work needs to be done to work with teachers to both examine their own assumptions about gender equality and gender inequality, and then to be able to transfer that into gender responsive pedagogy that helps children, particularly children who are finding grave problems with schooling, because if you're having a bad time at school, your default position is probably just to replicate what's going on in the society, which is a lot of ideas about gender inequality. So I think what it highlights is the long road to travel.
Yeah. No, I mean, the data we have is that we know that there's a correlation there, but we don't know the direction of the causality. So what our data seems to suggest is that children that are doing well in school, and that also fits with the inclusion score, that are feeling included in the classroom, are feeling able to participate, seem to be more confident about also expressing gender equitable views, but we don't quite know which way that direction is working. So we need more research, basically.
That is a statistical thing, because you need an instrumental variable, and bigger data to separate those relationships. But yeah, that would be very interesting. We've got another question, please? Yeah. Let's take two. So here, and there's another one there. Yes. So let's take two at one then.
Okay. Hi. Thank you for your presentation. My question is this. So one of the research questions was whether or not the teacher trainees in the teacher training course were taught anything on gender. And so they were. But at this point, were there already a curriculum in place in the teacher training course, or did you give it to them? And a follow-up to that is that were there a difference in the different subjects that were in the teacher training course? Because there would be teacher trainees for English subject or for science and maths. And how was this in place? And later on, when these teachers went to school, how did they then execute this? I understand that there were the data was not very accurate, etc., because of the issues. But if you have any input on this, how would they then teach this in the schools?
Yeah. Yeah, so in 2012, I said this rather quickly and didn't unpack it. In 2012, these minimum standards for teacher training were introduced by the government that were meant to be rolled out in all universities and teacher training colleges about how gender equality was to be taught. And it was both overall as part of the curriculum for teacher education, and then there were specific elements for English or social studies or whatever. And that was why we designed the study, to see whether that policy that had been adopted in 2012, how it was being interpreted or rolled out. And we found not very much. Which makes the finding, when we went to schools and talked to teachers, some of whom had their teacher education before that policy had been enacted, found that they had more gender equitable, this was in the cohort as a whole, more gender equitable views than the younger teachers. That was a little bit surprising, but I think what it raises again is how much the political, socio-economic context of what had happened in the different states over the decades before and after 2012 needs to be understood. We can't, but clearly, and the study is only one of hundreds that find this, that writing something on a policy doesn't mean it will be carried out. In fact, how it's carried out and in what ways is going to be extremely variable. And then what we found in schools varied again. So the socio-political context of the school varied as to the amount of which people said they'd had any background teaching in gender equitable issues and any CPD. At that more or less the same time, that this gender equality minimum standards were being introduced, there was also reforms being introduced about learner-centered pedagogy. And although we didn't do the study, one of our MA students later did a study. She found very similar findings around learner-centered pedagogy. While it had, and I think a lot more money went into the training of teachers in learner-centered pedagogy than went into gender equality, but it was equally very unevenly rolled out.
Might I just add a little bit to that? Some of the work that we've done in Turkey has looked very much around the policies here, this is what we want to see happen in the classroom. But the work that we did in Turkey identified that, of course, as we know, the classroom is in and of itself, but it's also affected by the community. So what worked well in changing gender attitudes and understanding gender issues was that what was going on in the classroom was supported by an advertising campaign on the TV and on the radio. There was a whole cartoon series that we developed. And I think when we're looking at this, we have to thinking about implementation, we have to see that what we want to happen in schools has got to be supported in a community context. And similarly, the work I was doing in Jamaica a few years ago, same thing happened. It was the same thing, that we realized that while we were saying this is what we want to happen in schools, this is what the evidence is telling us is good in schools, if that child leaves the school and then goes out into a community where that is not supported, then we're asking too much of the schools. And as a teacher, I always think that we ask too much of the schools, and we have to recognise that schools can only do so much, and it's got to be within a community context, particularly for this kind of work to be effective.
Fantastic. There was another question here. Okay, carry on. And another one. So we'll get this one. Yeah.
So thank you for the presentation, first of all. And now, because I'm not familiar with education in Nigeria, many around here are more familiar than I am. I would just like to ask, because this was really nice, but I have no idea, how is gender inequity observed in education actually in Nigeria? Like, how do you see this in schools actually happening? If you could give us some examples, like practically.
Well, yeah, large numbers of, I can't reel off the figures at this moment, but there's a big proportion of children out of school in Nigeria, and girls are more than boys in that number. Girls, in the top years of primary school, girls fail to progress and fail to complete primary school. And in the Nigerian exams at the end of the primary phase and at the end of the junior secondary phase, at the end of the 8 years of schooling, and again at senior education levels, senior certificate levels, again girls are not doing as well as boys, which is not the kind of pattern we tend to see in tests around the world, where girls tend to do better than boys in language and written subjects, and maybe not so well in maths or whatever. And so we're seeing gender inequalities as a feature of access, progression, and attainment. And then it's a massive feature of the labour market. So fewer women in formal sector jobs, fewer women in political positions of decision making. Not that there are none, because there are state governors who are women, there are impressive lawyers and engineers who are women, but much gender inequality is a feature of the whole society, and there are aspects of the legal structure as well, which I could talk about in some states where child marriage is not illegal in some of the northern states, and those kinds of issues. So does that give you enough of a flavour? Are there people from Nigeria here who would like to add? Because I feel very awkward having Please, yeah.
My question is, thanks very much for the presentation, it's really insightful. My question just really goes back to what somebody was asking about the curriculum for teacher training. So you did mention that there was a minimum standard introduced about gender equality in teacher education. What I'm not getting a sense of is whether the research actually looked at the curriculum for teacher training and how that policy informed the curriculum for teacher training. So perhaps the cohort of teachers that you interviewed. So there was a new policy that was introduced in 2012, but they've been trained with an adjusted or an amended curriculum to incorporate that for what these teachers, so the study look at the curriculum for teacher training following the new policy that was introduced. Also, there is research that suggests that the quality of teacher training in Nigeria and in sub-Saharan Africa is not so good in terms of the quality of teachers that are produced by the system. So I just wonder how the education quality in the context really affects the expectations that you took into the research in terms of how the assumptions that was made about gender, and if the quality of education that's produced or the quality of teachers that's produced in the system is questionable. Did that sort of affect how you were approaching the research and what you were anticipating?
So I'll answer the second question first. We didn't assume the quality of teacher education was low, and we didn't assume that that teaching was poor. In fact, one of the findings from the earlier study that preceded this, the one we'd done for ActionAid, I and a team from the Institute had done for ActionAid, we'd actually found very good levels of teacher education in some of those northern states, and maybe there was one southern state that was in that study. So I certainly didn't go into the study at all with an assumption that the quality of teaching, and a lot of my writing has been kind of criticizing these assumptions, these deficit models of African teachers, and saying that African teachers are part of the problem. I'm very, very critical of that assessment, and part of the intention of the study was try to find out what are the conditions of work of teachers, what are they taught, how are they supported. So that was where the study started, not in the deficit side of the page. We did look at and did ask questions of the teacher educators at each of the institutions where we collected data of whether they had implemented the minimum standards, whether they had been able to roll it out or not. And we got rather sparse kinds of, the data was difficult to use because I think they felt that we were doing an audit of whether they were carrying out government policy that should have been rolled out. So what we found was much more illuminating was their responses to when they described what they were teaching, so how much they were teaching about inclusion. So those categories that Amy showed when we developed the teacher inclusion score, teacher education inclusion score, we were drawing on the curriculum document. So all those things were to be mentioned in the curriculum document, but we asked them how much you are actually teaching about that, and we asked the students. So it came into the research design, but people's reflections on it were not that illuminating. Does that answer your question? Enough.
Just to add to that, thinking about what I said at the end about sort of the implementation, we have always worked with curricular bodies, and when we get some good sound evidence, it's very helpful to us to be able to say, well, this is what our evidence is telling us. However, when you do work with those agencies, what they will say, understandably, is we want our children to be reading and writing and all of those things which we want them to be doing. So the gender equity and thinking about a sort of gender responsive teaching may not necessarily be their priority. So even though we do get this very sound evidence that we would want to share with them and use in our discussions, you can see why they would perhaps not see that as a priority, and the very fact that they don't see it as a priority is one of the issues that makes this issue continue.
And sorry, I know there's one more question, but just to comment on that, Yvette, because our study in Lagos of the public and private schools found this huge difference between the private schools who said, we don't really care about gender equality, we're teaching reading and writing and arithmetic. And I think today DFID has just published another study of public and private schools in Lagos, which shows that private schools children do better than public schools when all other things are held the same. But they didn't ask them about their attitudes to gender equality. So this is an area to look at again and again.
We have time for 2 questions. Let me see. How many people want to ask a question? One is here. Any other one? Your hand was up. Did you get your answer? You wanted to ask a question earlier? No. So one. Any other person who wants to ask a question? Just one? 2? A chance for a third one? All right. So we'll take these 2 and then we'll bring it up. So please.
Firstly, thank you for the presentation. And my my question is, and I'm not sure if you just answered it and I missed the answer in your response to the previous question, but you mentioned training, and I was wondering what kind of training did those who trained the teachers to roll out the gender equity in education program receive themselves? So how far back are we going, firstly? And secondly, we always talk about how equality isn't necessarily sought, or I'll rephrase, how parity doesn't necessarily, and attainment and progression don't necessarily inform or provide a complete picture of equality in education. And I think those were the indicators that you referred to when asked how inequality was manifested or explored before the research took off. If you could comment on that. Thanks.
Could we take that one as well, and then we get a response to both of them?
My voice is loud.
Please, go ahead.
Thank you. I come from Nigeria, and I live all along in Nigeria. I'm assuming that before you conducted research that you worked in Ministry of Education, because just from, and this is not an assumption, I know that firstly, in Nigeria, teachers are the bottom of the food chain when it comes to them, and it's really sad, but that's what it is. And so it's fine, gender equality, but you want to come in and conduct research on gender equality, in education. But the issue, the greater issue is changing the endemic mindsets. Thinking of people in Nigeria, and that's the greater problem. I really do understand where you're coming from, but there's a bigger problem than that in Nigeria.
Yeah. I mean, in a way, you've answered the first speaker, that the engagement with gender equality in education can sometimes be extremely superficial, And there can be an issue about bring girls into school while you keep all the structures of inequality, political, economic, social, cultural, mobility-wise, representation-wise, you name it. A lot of it is in that British Council report, and I think the Nigerians in the class will have a lot to say, or sorry, in the room, have a lot to say. So yes, I was giving the kind of broad brushstroke gender parity figures to sketch a tiny bit of a very complex story. And it's very, very complex regionally, state-wise, class-wise, ethnic-wise, and you know, lifetimes will be spent writing about that. Yes, we did have the permission of the Ministries of Education to conduct the research, and it was all the study, all the data collection was done by our team in Nigeria, and a lot of the reflection on the findings was done in various discussion workshops, which you know, we're presenting the findings, but they're the distillation of a lot of insight from people much closer to the problem. And I think you are asking about the training for the teacher education lecturers and university lecturers. Just about none. So the very interesting spin-off from this project that Yvette was mentioned at the end, the gender education
advocacy.
Yeah, it had a very, very innovative design in that I think the British Council team that ran the project asked for bids, and they needed to be by college lecturers, a member of an NGO, and someone from a government, and they put together these little projects, or they weren't little, they were big issues. But one of the things, I know I spoke to one of their early meetings, was how little engagement with gender was part of the professional work. How little time people had to read or think or discuss about it, and how rich the exchanges were. We had the most wonderful day of discussing all these issues, but how you take that to scale, how you create that as part of a dialogue, because often the people who came to that network meeting, they would be, I'll just give you, I won't name the state, but you know, really, really insightful people, but they were low down in the state administration, someone quite low down in the teacher education, and someone not the head of a big NGO. So they had lots to say, lots of insight, but how or where they could take it forward wasn't immediately obvious, and maybe that's where you're going to go next with some of these things, I hope.
Just a small
suggestion.
Thank you very much, presenters. They've given us a lot to go with in relation to the topic, the insights from the research, and loads of questions and loads of work for you. Those who are students, you've got a real world there to go and change, and those who are already working, of course, we're hoping that you're making the world a better place. So we'll give them a round of applause, please. Thank you for coming. Thank you again for the presenters. Thank you, William, for making it happen. If you don't have, if William doesn't have your email, please, if you want to stay plugged into what we do here in relation to the seminar series, please talk to him after. Done.
Thank you.
Interesting. Really enjoyed it. I also learned a lot.
That's what I like to hear. It was really, really good to speak to. As I said, you know, you read it and then you get the nuance. It was great. I really enjoyed it.
Hello.
Thank you, Yvette. Nice to go.
Yeah.
How are you?
Elaine.
Okay.
It's that way. Okay. Okay.
Yes.
I'm going to camp outside. Where is it? I've been to. Okay, so we will be.
Yeah, but
We'll be seeing each other.